"Clear your desk before 5, she said that morning, as if my 4 years of keeping this company alive were just trash. Nobody dared look at me. They knew the one getting fired was the only reason the lights were still on. Then the new investor walked in, ignored the executives, and looked straight at me. In that cold silence, everyone realized too late that their perfect script was already dead. My name is Alina Price. If you want to understand how a perfect corporate betrayal is built, you have to look at the room before the knife goes in. It was a bleak Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio. The sky outside the glass windows was the color of wet concrete, heavy, unforgiving. Inside the headquarters of Norval Response Logistics, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a sickly hum. We were an organization supposedly dedicated to saving lives by keeping medical supply chains intact, but that morning, the only thing being carved up and left for dead was my career. We were gathered in the main conference room for a mandatory internal meeting. The air was suffocating. It carried that specific, sour sweat that only precedes a capital due diligence week. New investors were arriving soon. Millions of dollars were hanging on the line. I stood near the back, my shoulders pressed firmly against the cold glass door. Cradled tightly in my arms was a massive binder. It contained 3 solid weeks of my life. Hundreds of grueling hours of sleepless nights, cross-referenced supplier maps, contingency protocols. It was the absolute lifeblood of Norval, formatted perfectly for the incoming executive suits. I was physically exhausted, but I was proud, foolishly. I still thought we were all playing for the same team. Serena Vale, our chief operating officer, took the absolute center of the room. Serena wore impeccably sharp suits and an even sharper, practiced smile. She possessed this specific tone of voice, a chillingly sweet, highly modulated cadence. It was the exact pitch needed to dress up a brutal act as a brilliant strategic pivot. Before we dive into the operational metrics for the upcoming audit, Serena began, her voice echoing sharply off the glass, I want to share a brief update on our internal structure. She did not look at me, not even a passing glance. Instead, she fixed her gaze on a blank spot just above the heads of the anxious crowd. As we actively streamline our departments to prepare for this next phase of growth, we have made the decision to part ways with Alina Price. Today will officially be her last day here at Norval. The words left her mouth and flash froze the entire room. Just like that. 4 years of loyalty, endless overtime, desperate problem-solving. All of it erased in 2 sterile sentences. There were exactly 27 people crammed into that conference room. I knew every single one of them. I knew whose children were sick. I knew who desperately needed advances on their paychecks. I knew who I had covered for when a late-night transport had gone disastrously wrong. Yet, in that defining second, not a single person dared to speak up. I stood frozen. My knuckles turned white around my binder. I watched as 27 pairs of eyes found absolutely anything else to stare at. They stared at the cheap gray carpet. They stared deeply into the dark depths of their paper coffee cups. They tapped mindlessly on their cell phones. It was a perfectly synchronized act of cowardice. The silence was deafening. It was a loud, overwhelming refusal to acknowledge the public slaughter happening right in front of them. Slowly, I shifted my gaze to Mason Weller, our chief executive officer. He leaned casually against the polished edge of the mahogany table. His expensive jacket was unbuttoned, his arms crossed over his chest. Mason was supposed to be the fearless captain of this chaotic ship. Instead, he just watched. He observed the scene with the detached interest of someone reviewing a minor administrative glitch. He did not blink. He did not step in to offer even a single hollow word of gratitude. I had poured literal blood and sweat into keeping his failing company afloat. His profound silence was the final nail in the coffin. It confirmed what my gut already knew. This was a premeditated execution, planned in the shadows and approved at the highest level. Serena was not finished. She smoothed the front lapel of her blazer and offered one last honey-coated directive. Alina, we will need your desk completely cleared out by 5 o'clock this evening. We are bringing in a new integration lead early next week. We need the workspace prepped and ready for his arrival. Human resources will handle the logistics of your departure. An integration lead. That was just a shiny new title for someone who would inevitably sit in my worn-out chair. Someone who would use my systems and happily take full credit for my architecture. The heavy binder resting in my arms suddenly felt exactly like a marble tombstone. I did not cry or raise my voice. I refused to give Serena Vale the satisfaction of a public breakdown. I refused to give Serena Vale the twisted satisfaction of witnessing a public breakdown. I simply gave a single, rigid nod. My face was a locked mask of pure ice. I slowly turned my body around, pushed open the glass door, and calmly walked out of the conference room. The most terrifying part of that walk down the corridor was the realization that my legs were actually still holding me upright. My entire professional world had just been violently ripped out from under my feet. My financial security was suddenly shattered. My dedication was casually spat upon, yet my physical body miraculously continued to function through sheer mechanical shock. Every single step I took echoed loudly on the polished hardwood floor. Each heavy footfall was a stark testament to the strange, numb resilience that automatically takes over when you are publicly humiliated. Let me paint a much clearer picture of what it actually means to be the invisible spine of a logistics company like this. Norval was not shipping boxes of paper clips. We moved highly volatile, life-saving medical supplies. We dealt with cold chain logistics. If a refrigerated truck broke down on a snowy interstate highway, critical insulin supplies spoiled, dialysis clinics shut down, real people suffered. For 4 brutal years, I was the sole person who answered the frantic phone calls at 2 a.m. when the automated dispatch failed. I built the emergency bridges between tough truckers and desperate hospital administrators. I did not just clock in for a standard job. I held a massive, high-stakes puzzle together with my bare hands. Sitting down heavily at my cramped desk, I stared at the dark computer monitor. The green light on my desk phone immediately began to flash rapidly. 3 separate missed calls from anxious clients who explicitly only trusted my direct extension. My desk was a lived-in mess. It was cluttered heavily with brightly colored sticky notes, complex hand-drawn vendor maps, and several half-eaten protein bars left over from chaotic nights where I simply never went home to sleep. They arrogantly wanted all of this cleared out before 5 o'clock. They expected 4 years of my life to be neatly packed into a cheap brown cardboard box in less than 8 hours. The sheer audacity of Serena's sickly sweet voice replayed over and over in my tired mind. The slick corporate jargon she weaponized to seamlessly sanitize a targeted career assassination. Strategic pivot. Streamline. Integration lead. These were the cowardly words weak people used when they lacked the human spine to look you in the eye and admit they were stealing everything you built. They desperately wanted me gone right before the new investors arrived because I was the only person who fully knew the unpolished truth. I knew exactly how fragile this entire company really was. I knew exactly which internal wires were dangerously crossed and precisely which financial numbers were wildly inflated. Mason's total silence was just as loud as Serena's announcement. He knew exactly what he was doing by letting her wield the axe. They were furiously cleaning house. They were desperately preparing a highly polished, sanitized version of Norval for the due diligence team. My messy, honest reality simply did not fit cleanly into their beautiful slide decks. But what those executives fundamentally failed to realize was that you cannot just casually delete the lead architect and expect the building to stand tall when the inevitable hurricane makes landfall. I slowly placed the thick binder down on the center of my desk. The thud it made sounded exactly like a judge's gavel slamming down. My hands were shaking slightly, not from sorrow or fear. They were shaking from a rapidly rising white-hot clarity. The initial shock was fading, rapidly replaced by the incredibly sharp, analytical mindset that made me so good at my job. In the world of high-stakes logistics, when there is a catastrophic failure, you do not panic. You assess the root cause. You coldly trace the fatal error back to its exact point of origin. I looked down at the rapidly flashing green light on my desk phone once again. Those were my loyal clients calling. my relationships, the absolute trust I had personally forged over hundreds of tense crisis management calls. As the harsh reality of the morning finally settled deeply into my bones, a singular, burning thought cut effortlessly through the thick fog of their betrayal. It was a critical question that would ultimately become the complete undoing of Serena Vale, Mason Weller, and the entire house of cards they thought they controlled. Why would they actively choose to publicly fire the exact person who was solely responsible for holding almost 100 critical client relationships from completely collapsing? 4 years ago, I did not walk into this building wearing a tailored blazer or carrying a prestigious degree in supply chain management. I came through the back service elevator at 11 o'clock at night. I started on the graveyard shift. My exact title was Night Operations Coordinator, which was a polite corporate way of saying I was the human punching bag for every cold chain medical transport that broke down between midnight and 6 in the morning. I did not climb the corporate ladder by networking at expensive golf courses or kissing the rings of vice presidents. I learned how this industry really worked from the people the executives upstairs deliberately ignored. I sat in drafty loading docks drinking terrible gas station coffee with long-haul truck drivers. I learned the names of the warehouse dispatchers who worked the holiday shifts. I memorized the voices of the cold chain managers and the exhausted heads of receiving at rural medical clinics. They were the ones who actually knew why a shipment of critical biologics failed. They knew the routing software the executives spent millions of dollars on was utterly useless when an ice storm hit Interstate 70. From that gritty, boots-on-the-ground reality, I started building something of my own. I called it the Bridge Ledger. It was not some flashy multi-million-dollar software integration with a slick user interface. It was a battered, heavily encrypted spreadsheet and a meticulously curated digital Rolodex. It was a living, breathing backup network of alternative trucking routes, emergency-leased cold storage units in off-the-grid industrial parks, and independent sub-suppliers. Most importantly, the Bridge Ledger was a collection of personal cell phone numbers belonging to real, reliable human beings who would actually answer my call and save a dying shipment at 2 in the morning. The executives upstairs love to talk about automated contingency plans, but automation does not drive a forklift through a flooded warehouse. People do. I remember the catastrophic blizzard of 2022. The main highways were entirely shut down. Hearthline Senior Network, one of our biggest regional clients, had 3 facilities running dangerously low on respiratory medications. The automated system simply flagged the shipments as delayed due to weather and queued an automated apology email. I bypassed the system. I used the Bridge Ledger to contact an independent driver named Ramona, who had a specialized rig with heavy chains. I routed her through county backroads using the mental map a dispatcher in Toledo had taught me a year prior. We got the medication to Hearthline with exactly 4 hours to spare. 6 months later, a massive regional fuel strike paralyzed the traditional freight lines. Lakehaven Dialysis Partners was staring down the barrel of turning away dozens of patients because their specialized fluids were stuck in a stalled transit hub. Serena Vale and her team were busy drafting legal force majeure letters to protect the company from liability. Meanwhile, I was on my personal cell phone, negotiating space on a local agricultural transport that happened to have a functioning refrigeration unit. I saved that account while the executive suite was busy covering their own tracks. Because of the Bridge Ledger, Norval survived multiple fiscal quarters that the board of directors had privately written off as total losses. Our retention rate for key accounts skyrocketed, and it was not because of Norval's glossy marketing brochures or Serena's perfectly rehearsed pitch meetings. It was because I absolutely refused to sell our clients empty corporate promises. If I said a truck was going to be there, it was there. I called them back exactly when I promised I would. I showed up mentally and emotionally when the worst-case scenarios happened. Most importantly, I remembered the very human fears of the people on the other end of the telephone line. I knew the clinic manager at Lakehaven was terrified of losing a patient on her watch. Not just missing a delivery quota, but the reward for digging the trenches is usually just a bigger shovel. Up in the glass-walled conference rooms, the narrative was masterfully rewritten. I would submit my quarterly incident resolution reports, detailing exactly how the bridge ledger had bypassed a logistics nightmare. Weeks later, I would sit in the back row of a town hall meeting and listen to Serena Vale present those exact saves. She never used my name. She never mentioned the bridge ledger. Instead, she confidently rebranded my blood, sweat, and sleepless nights as the executive board's strategic continuity framework. When the slides went up on the projector, my name only ever appeared in the tiny font of the implementation column. I was positioned as a mere data entry clerk executing their brilliant, high-level vision. I let it happen. That is the hardest truth to swallow. I allowed them to steal my ghost because I was too busy actually doing the work to fight for the spotlight. The personal toll was staggering. A silent debt I accrued while keeping Norval in the black. I completely abandoned the concept of a personal life. I missed my best friend's wedding because a temperature-controlled freight train derailed in Nebraska. I spent countless weekends sleeping in my uncomfortable office chair, wrapped in a thin promotional fleece jacket, waiting for confirmation that a delayed vaccine shipment had cleared a customs checkpoint. The heaviest price was paid at home, when my mother underwent a grueling 6-month recovery from a severe spinal surgery. I could not afford to take a leave of absence. Norval needed me. So, I sat by her hospital bed, holding her fragile hand with my left hand, while my right hand furiously typed out rerouting protocols on my laptop. I coordinated emergency plasma deliveries for strangers while watching my own mother wince in pain. I never dropped a single client call. I never let a single shipment spoil. I gave Norval the absolute best parts of my youth, my energy, and my family time. I did all of this because I blindly believed in a very American, very dangerous myth. I genuinely believe that if you keep your head down, work harder than everyone else in the room, and become undeniably indispensable, the results will naturally protect you. I thought merit was an invisible shield. I thought the sheer, undeniable weight of the money I saved them and the clients I retained would be my ultimate armor. I believed the work would speak for itself. The public execution in that conference room shattered that childish illusion into a million jagged pieces. As I sat at my desk, looking at the blinking lights of my loyal clients, trying to reach a woman who no longer technically existed in the corporate directory, the cold, hard reality washed over me. Results do not speak for themselves. In the ruthless machinery of modern corporate America, merit is entirely subjective. The raw numbers, the saved shipments, the late nights, they are just silent raw materials. The only thing that actually matters is who gets to stand on the stage and weave those materials into a compelling story. The person holding the microphone is the only one who gets to write the history. Looking back from the cold, harsh reality of my desk, the autopsy of my own corporate execution was terrifyingly simple to perform. The definitive signs of professional betrayal are rarely loud. They do not announce themselves with screaming arguments or dramatic boardroom showdowns. They are quiet, methodical, and deeply administrative. They happen in shared network folders, in casually worded emails, and behind soundproof glass walls. Exactly 3 weeks before my public slaughter, Serena Vale summoned me into her massive corner office. The room always smelled of expensive bergamot and aggressive ambition. She sat comfortably behind a sprawling glass desk, offering me a rare, highly calculated, predatory smile. It was the kind of smile a hunter gives a very useful tracking dog right before the final hunt. The new investment fund is incredibly focused on our operational disruption resistance capability, Serena had said, steepling her perfectly manicured fingers. They want to see the absolute worst-case scenarios and how we survive them. I need you to pull together everything you have. The crisis management playbooks, your localized sub-supplier maps, the risk classification models, the simulation scripts, and every single one of your toughest, most complex case studies. I swallowed the glittering bait whole. I was physically exhausted, but I was blindingly ambitious. I genuinely thought that if this massive financial acquisition was successful, it would finally be my long-awaited career breakthrough. I thought the quiet, invisible architect was finally being invited to sit permanently at the high executive table. For the next 21 days, I worked almost entirely without sleep. I meticulously translated 4 years of gritty, street-level survival into pristine, easily digestible corporate analytics. I compiled massive data sets proving exactly how we bypassed regional power grid failures. I documented the specific communication protocols I used to secure emergency freight space when the major carriers completely shut down. I was handing over the heavy iron keys to the entire operational kingdom, foolishly believing I would be crowned its primary guardian. Then, the subtle extraction quietly shifted gears. Grant Holloway, our vice president of strategy, began hovering around my cramped cubicle. Grant was a man who spoke entirely in hollow buzzwords and possessed the operational instinct of a potted houseplant. He started casually requesting the raw, foundational materials rather than the finished summaries. "Alina, could you shoot me the original working files for the winter contingency models?" Grant asked one rainy afternoon, casually leaning his weight against my fabric partition. "Just the raw data logs and your personal internal notes. We need to completely standardize the visual formatting for the final presentation deck going to the Capital Group." I sent him the native files. The raw, unprotected spreadsheets, the unpolished, deeply personal draft documents. I handed over the raw architecture of my work without a second thought. Slowly, the systematic erasure of my identity began. I started noticing fragments of my highly specific language appearing verbatim in the master slide decks Serena was proudly circulating to the senior executive team. Phrases I had desperately coined at 2 a.m. while desperately rerouting refrigerated trucks were suddenly being touted as her visionary leadership pillars. The logic models were mine. The contingency matrices were mine. But my name had completely vanished from the authorship metadata. I was rapidly becoming a disposable ghost in my own machine. Around the exact same time, a new, unfamiliar name began floating ominously through the sterile corporate hallways. Nolan Cade. He was officially being brought on as an integration lead, but the hushed, nervous whispers by the break room water cooler painted a much different, darker picture. Nolan was an external hire, a remarkably close associate of Serena from a previous logistics firm. He was the man Serena actually wanted sitting comfortably in my chair when the millions of dollars in new investment capital finally cleared the bank accounts. But as I sat completely frozen at my desk on the morning of my supposed termination, the sharp, analytical part of my brain caught a massive, glaring administrative inconsistency. It was a terrifying realization that made the blood in my veins run completely ice cold. I began to view the entire situation not as a grieving employee, but as a forensic investigator examining a carefully staged crime scene. I had just been publicly fired in front of the entire department, yet my inbox was completely empty of any official, legally binding communication from the Human Resources Department. There was absolutely no calendar invite for a mandatory exit interview. There was no formal severance package document waiting for my electronic signature. There was no notification of my final paycheck being expedited or processed. I slowly reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my plastic corporate access badge. I stood up, walked deliberately over to the highly secure server room door located at the end of the hall, and swiped the magnetic strip against the black digital reader. The small light blinked a solid, cheerful green. The heavy reinforced door clicked open instantly. I walked straight back to my desk and refreshed my dual computer monitors. My secure, high-level administrative login was still fully active. I navigated deeply into the central compliance portal, bypassing 3 separate firewalls. My name was still legally and permanently listed as the primary, authorized holder of the critical operational certificates directly related to the bridge ledger. They had not disconnected me. They had not formally processed my termination. On paper, legally speaking, I was still the one driving the truck. Suddenly, Tessa Rowe, my closest colleague and the senior accounts manager, slid silently into the empty guest chair right next to my desk. Her face was chalky pale, and she kept her eyes glued tightly to her own digital tablet, so no one walking past would notice her talking to the dead woman. "They are not just looking at the beautiful presentation slides, Alina," Tessa whispered, her voice trembling slightly with genuine fear. The new investors. I just saw the highly classified, updated agenda on the secure executive drive. They demanded a live operational simulation. They want to see the system react organically to a real-time crisis before they sign the final check. The final, devastating puzzle piece clicked violently and perfectly into place. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their master plan hit me so hard I physically gasped for air. The cold sweat of absolute clarity broke out on my forehead. They did not fire me because I was useless. They did not fire me because they were simply downsizing. They fired me precisely after they had successfully extracted every single piece of critical operational knowledge they possibly could. But more importantly, they could not actually replace me before the massive capital audit. Serena Vale was not just planning to take credit for my hard work. She was planning to confidently execute a live high-stakes simulation using my exact playbooks, my personal sub-supplier maps, and my deeply complex emergency protocols, while standing proudly on a stage pretending the entire architecture was her own brilliant, visionary creation. She desperately needed me physically out of the building today, not because I was officially fired, but because she simply could not risk the sharp, analytical investors looking past her shiny, heavily rehearsed presentation and seeing the real architect standing quietly behind the curtain. She intended to step into my role and pass my work off as her own to secure the funding. But the most terrifying part was the legal trap sitting right in front of me on my monitors. Because my formal termination had not been processed, because my active system credentials were still live, and because my signature was still on those critical compliance certificates, I was completely exposed. If anything went disastrously wrong during that live simulation, if a simulated load failed or a fake patient was lost, the system logs would point entirely to me. Serena would not just take the millions in credit if it worked. She would legally let me take the absolute blame if it completely collapsed. I was not just being fired. I was being perfectly framed. To the untrained eye, Norval Response Logistics looked like a sleek corporate machine preparing for a massive public offering. If you walked through the front lobby, you saw polished marble floors, glowing digital metrics boasting about 99% on-time delivery rates, and walls decorated with expensively framed mission statements. It looked like a company flush with cash and drowning in endless market opportunity. But if you actually knew how to read a balance sheet, you knew the building was structurally compromised. The oxygen was rapidly running out. Inside the executive suites, the air was thick with the distinct, metallic scent of financial panic. Our operating margins were bone-thin, hovering precariously around 3% on a good quarter. The company was heavily chained to a massive, highly restrictive term loan taken out 2 years prior. The aggressive covenants of that loan dictated that if our cash reserves dipped below a specific threshold for 30 consecutive days, the bank could essentially seize the operational assets. The executives were not seeking new capital to fuel global expansion. They were begging for a massive financial tourniquet to stop the corporate bleeding before we flatlined. That is exactly why Briarcrest Capital was flying in from New York. Briarcrest was not a firm of optimistic angel investors who threw money at vague potential and inspiring slide decks. They were apex predators in the private equity ecosystem. They specialized in distressed assets. They bought companies that were hours away from catastrophic failure, gutted the dead weight, and restructured the profitable bones. They were coming to Columbus to decide if Norval was actually worth saving, or if it was more profitable to simply let us drown and buy our client list at a bankruptcy auction. The man leading the due diligence team was Elias Thorne. His reputation preceded him through terrifying whispers among the executive assistants. Elias was notorious in the logistics sector for publicly humiliating chief executive officers who tried to sell him marketing fluff instead of hard operational reality. He fundamentally hated beautifully designed presentations that completely fell apart the second a real-world variable was introduced. He did not care about our branded corporate synergy. He only cared about whether the trucks actually moved when the sky fell down. Briarcrest had one highly specific reason for focusing their predatory gaze on Norval. Several months ago, a massive regional healthcare conglomerate, which happened to be a cornerstone anchor in the Briarcrest portfolio, had experienced a severe logistics failure during a regional blackout. They survived only because they were quietly routed through an emergency network operated by an unnamed vendor. The portfolio managers started referring to it internally as the Ohio Overnight Rescue Model. They traced the convoluted paperwork back to Norval. Elias Thorne wanted to buy the exact machine that pulled off that miracle. He wanted the absolute certainty of my crisis architecture to protect his other investments. Serena Vale, possessing the cunning survival instincts of a cornered animal, had smelled the investor interest immediately. She knew Briarcrest was specifically hunting for the Ohio model. So, in the shadows, she took my gritty, dirt-stained bridge ledger, scrubbed away the human sweat, and ran it through a corporate car wash. She violently stripped my name off the digital architecture and rapidly rebranded the entire ecosystem. She called her stolen masterpiece the North Star Continuity Framework. It sounded expensive. It sounded like something a highly compensated chief operating officer would invent during an exclusive executive retreat. She seamlessly attached this shiny new label to her own leadership portfolio, ready to serve it to Elias Thorne on a silver platter, but Serena made one critical, deeply arrogant mistake. In her massive rush to clear my physical body from the premises, she completely forgot to coordinate with the Information Technology Department to immediately revoke my top-level security clearances. Sitting in the eerie quiet of my cubicle, watching my desk phone flash with desperate client voicemails, I kept my hands steady on my keyboard. I dragged my mouse across the screen and clicked deep into the secure executive drive. The digital folders opened instantly, offering absolutely no resistance. I bypassed the standard financial summaries and went straight for the locked administrative vault containing the materials prepared specifically for the Briarcrest arrival. I opened the master itinerary. I saw the highly detailed schedules, the catered lunch orders, and the exact sequence of presentations. Then, my eyes locked onto a subfolder labeled as Final Legal Compliance. My chest tightened as I double-clicked the icon. A massive, heavily encrypted PDF document populated my screen. It was the formal operational warranty appendix. This was the legally binding document that assured the investors, under penalty of federal wire fraud, that the crisis management systems presented in the pitch were fully operational, stress-tested, and currently active. I scrolled down past the endless pages of dense legal jargon. I scrolled past the liability waivers. I reached the final page, the designated signature block. The air trapped in my lungs suddenly turned to heavy lead. Right there, on line item 42, next to a date stamp showing it had been processed just 24 hours ago, was my full name, Alina Price. And right beside my printed name, securely embedded into the digital fabric of the document, was my authorized electronic signature. It was the exact cryptographic key issued to me by the compliance department 4 years ago. I stared at the glowing blue pixels of my forged consent until my vision blurred. I had never seen this document before in my entire life. I had never received an authorization request. I had never clicked approve. The sheer gravity of the situation slammed into me like a speeding freight train. The narrative instantly and violently shifted from a tragic story of corporate theft to a terrifying scenario of criminal liability. They were not just stealing my hard work to secure a $15 million lifeline, they were actively weaponizing my legal identity. Serena and Mason were fully aware that the North Star Continuity Framework was a complete house of cards without my daily, manual intervention. They knew that if Briarcrest injected the capital, and the system subsequently collapsed during the next major winter storm, the investors would immediately sue Norval for extreme misrepresentation and fraud. When the federal investigators and the angry corporate lawyers came hunting for the person who falsely certified the broken system, Serena would simply point at the signed compliance appendix. She would show them my electronic signature. She would confidently testify that the rogue, disgruntled former employee, Alina Price, had legally guaranteed the framework before she was rightfully terminated for poor performance. If I quietly packed my cardboard box, turned in my plastic badge, and walked out the front doors into the bleak Ohio afternoon, I would not just be walking away empty-handed. I would be walking directly into a massive legal slaughterhouse. Serena would take all the financial glory of saving the company, and I would be left carrying the devastating, life-ruining liability when her stolen machine inevitably burned to the ground. My hands finally stopped shaking. A profound, terrifying calm washed entirely over my mind. The time for silent, enduring loyalty was completely dead. The time for gathering weapons had officially begun. I did not storm into Serena Vale's pristine corner office to scream, throw things, or demand the justice I was owed. I did not shed a single tear as I packed my cheap cardboard box. Anger without a structured strategy is just a temper tantrum, and in the ruthless ecosystem of corporate logistics, emotions have absolutely no currency. The only thing that holds weight, the only thing that can actually stop an executive firing squad, is irrefutable proof attached to a hard, digital timestamp. Instead of fighting a loud, losing battle on their chosen turf, I spent the next 72 hours quietly building an ironclad prosecution. My first meeting was with Ramona Pike. Ramona owned a fiercely independent network of heavy-duty refrigerated trucks, the kind driven by men and women who do not care about corporate synergy. We met early the next morning at a highly unremarkable diner positioned just off the interstate. Over 2 cups of bitter black coffee, I explained exactly what had happened. Ramona did not offer pity. She offered ammunition. She slid her heavy smartphone across the sticky laminate table. Displayed on her screen was a text message sent directly from Serena's executive assistant just 3 days prior. Norval had recently asked Ramona for a vendor testimonial to include in the investor packet. Ramona had written a glowing paragraph specifically detailing how my midnight interventions had saved 3 major accounts. The text message from the executive suite read, "Ramona, we love the statement, but we need you to revise it and completely remove Alina's name. We want to position this as an overarching company-wide operational success. Please resubmit by 5 o'clock. I took a high-resolution photograph of the screen, ensuring the date, the time, and the sender's contact information were perfectly visible. It was the first solid brick in my fortress. Later that same afternoon, I drove out to a sprawling industrial park to visit Deke Halverson. Deke managed the massive auxiliary cold storage facility that I had utilized as a critical emergency overflow during the last 3 winter crises. Deke was a pragmatic man who despised corporate politics, but he looked deeply uncomfortable when I walked into his drafty warehouse office. After I promised him that his own contracts would not be jeopardized, he confessed something that made my blood run entirely cold. A week ago, Serena had personally called Deke. She asked him to sign a newly drafted emergency overflow agreement, which was entirely normal. However, she specifically instructed him to backdate his signature by exactly 8 months. She needed the paperwork to reflect that the executive board had secured this secondary storage initiative long before my own system. The bridge ledger had officially utilized it. They were actively falsifying operational history to make my organic, ground-level solutions look like top-down executive strategy. I walked out of Deke's office holding a photocopy of the heavily contested, backdated contract, featuring Serena's unmistakable handwriting on the attached sticky note, instructing him on exactly which fake date to use. My next target was the client side. I sat in my car in the empty warehouse parking lot and dialed Janelle Mercer, the senior operations manager for one of the largest regional clinic chains in the Midwest. Janelle's company accounted for nearly 15% of Norval's total quarterly revenue. When I told her I was officially no longer with the company, there was a stunned, heavy silence on the line. "Alina, we literally just signed a 2-year contract renewal last month," Janelle said, her voice laced with genuine anger. "And I told your vice president of strategy to his face exactly why we were staying. I told Grant Holloway that we renewed our contract exclusively because you are the only person who actually picks up the phone when everything is burning down. They promised me you would be the dedicated lead on our account." I quietly asked Janelle if she would be willing to put that exact sentiment in an email, addressed directly to me. She agreed without a single second of hesitation. With the external testimony secured, I turned my absolute focus to the internal digital footprint. Serena and Grant believed they had stripped my identity from the North Star continuity framework, but executive leadership rarely understands the deep, underlying architecture of the digital systems they claim to master. Through a secure back-channel virtual private network that Tessa Rowe had bravely left unmonitored for me, I logged into the company's cloud-based sharing system. I did not just download the polished presentation slides. I extracted the complete, unadulterated version histories of every single core document. The digital metadata told a story that Serena could never, ever talk her way out of. The underlying background files, the complex mathematical logic boards, and the intricate simulation scripts all unmistakably originated from my personal user directory. The creation dates stretched back years, long before Serena had even joined the company. I gathered every single time-stamped edit, proving exactly when Grant Holloway had copied my native files into his own folders to begin the erasure process. The most damning piece of internal evidence came directly from Tessa. Late that evening, she sent a heavily encrypted message to my personal phone. Attached was a highly confidential screenshot of a private, two-person chat log between Serena and Grant. They were discussing the final preparations for the Briarcrest investor presentation. Grant's message read, "I have pulled all the raw contingency data. We need to thoroughly sanitize authorship across all the primary logic boards before Elias Thorne brings his technical analysts into the data room. Make sure her digital fingerprints are completely wiped by Tuesday morning." Sanitize authorship. It was a sterile, utterly chilling phrase. It was the exact corporate terminology for premeditated professional theft. But the most dangerous discovery I made that night was buried deep within the parameters of the upcoming live operational simulation. I reviewed the precise metrics they planned to use to impress Elias Thorne. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs when I realized what they had chosen. They had blindly selected the absolute hardest, most brutal crisis scenario available in the system. It was a terrifying triple-threat convergence. A simultaneous catastrophic freeze of the core cold chain, a massive interstate gridlock, and an unprecedented sudden spike in medical demand from the regional dialysis centers. It was the exact same, devastating scenario I had barely managed to navigate manually last winter. It was a scenario that required deep, intuitive human intervention, not just automated software responses. If Serena attempted to run that simulation using only my stolen slides and without my actual, real-time working knowledge, the entire system would inevitably collapse under the artificial pressure. And then came the ultimate irony, a beautiful, poetic flaw in their hasty assassination plan. As I sat in the dim light of my living room, my cell phone suddenly vibrated sharply against the coffee table. A bright red notification illuminated the screen. It was an automated system alert from Norval's Central Dispatch, warning of a minor temperature fluctuation in a holding facility. The red alert system was still pouring its critical data directly into my personal phone. Serena had desperately wanted me gone, but the information technology department could not actually sever my direct contact number from the central crisis hierarchy without completely breaking the priority routing logic that I had built myself. Nobody inside that building knew how to manually decouple my identity from the machine without accidentally shutting down the entire early warning system. I was officially terminated, yet I was still the only person holding the operational pulse of the entire company in the palm of my hand. Staring at the glowing red alert, I made a very clear, unbreakable promise to myself. I established my absolute principle for the war that was about to begin. I would absolutely not save Serena Vale from the crushing, public humiliation she was actively walking into. I would let her stand under the blinding spotlights and choke on the stolen words she did not actually understand. However, if that live simulation somehow bled over into reality, if there was even a fractional risk that a real patient waiting for medication or a real truck driver navigating a dangerous highway was put in genuine jeopardy because of her supreme arrogance, I would immediately intervene. That specific decision anchored me firmly to the moral high ground. I was not a bitter, disgruntled employee trying to burn down the building just to watch the executives choke on the smoke. I was the actual architect, protecting the foundational integrity of the house I had built. I would not intentionally destroy Norval Response Logistics, but I absolutely refuse to let thieves use my quiet, enduring dedication as a convenient stepping stone for their own unearned wealth ever again. The evidence was gathered. The traps were fully set. All I had to do now was wait for the new investors to ask the right questions. The automatic glass doors of Norval Response Logistics parted with a soft hiss at exactly 8:45 in the morning. I stepped through the threshold, wearing a sharply tailored dark blue suit. It was the kind of heavy, structured armor you wear when you are walking directly onto a battlefield, rather than a standard corporate strategy retreat. My plastic access badge, the exact piece of plastic they arrogantly assumed I would never dare to use again, felt solid and heavy in my right hand. I pressed it firmly against the main security scanner. The small digital light blinked a solid, undeniable green. The heavy security turnstile clicked open. I was officially inside the fortress. The main executive boardroom was perfectly prepped for a high-stakes financial execution. The central air conditioning was set aggressively low, making the massive room feel exactly like a meat locker. I bypassed the reserved, leather-bound seating at the front of the long mahogany table. Instead, I walked quietly down the side aisle and took a simple fabric chair in the very back row, deliberately positioning myself in the cool shadows near the heavy oak doors. Serena Vale was standing near the front of the room, obsessively straightening a tall stack of glossy presentation folders. She looked up to scan the room, her eyes locked directly onto mine. For exactly 3 seconds, the polished, untouchable facade of the chief operating officer completely shattered. All the warm color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving behind a sickly, chalky white mask. Her jaw visibly tightened until the muscles ticked. She took a sudden half-step toward the back row, her eyes screaming a silent, violent threat, but she was entirely trapped by her own schedule. She absolutely could not cause a loud, messy public scene, because right at that exact moment, the heavy oak doors swung wide open. Elias Thorne walked into the room. He did not wear a necktie. He possessed the quiet, terrifying gravity of a man who routinely decided the ultimate fate of thousands of corporate jobs before he even finished his morning coffee. Flanking his left side was Mira Donnelly, his lead financial analyst. Mira was a sharp-featured woman whose calculating eyes were already scanning the layout of the room like a hawk looking for injured prey. On his right side walked Curtis Bale. Curtis represented the massive, unforgiving operational insurance conglomerate that was underwriting this entire multi-million-dollar acquisition. His mere presence in the room meant the risk assessment was deadly serious. If Curtis Bale did not like the operational security, the insurance premiums would completely bankrupt Norval before the ink on the contract even dried. Mason Weller, our supposedly fearless chief executive officer, immediately stepped up to the wooden podium. He offered weak, excessively sweaty handshakes to the incoming guests. Mason launched directly into his perfectly rehearsed, entirely hollow opening remarks. He spent exactly 10 minutes talking in endless, exhausting circles about sustainable market growth, the intrinsic value of our human capital, and his bold, disruptive vision for the future of cold-chain medical logistics. It was the standard, flavorless corporate appetizer designed exclusively to artificially inflate the fragile ego of the room. Elias Thorne did not even bother to open his thick leather notebook. He just stared blankly at Mason's expensive tie until the CEO awkwardly yielded the floor. Serena stepped confidently into the harsh glare of the overhead projector light. The massive digital screen behind her illuminated with a beautifully designed title slide. It read, North Star Continuity Framework in bold, aggressive lettering. It took every single ounce of self-control I possessed to keep my face perfectly neutral. For the next 25 minutes, I sat silently in the back of the freezing room and watched Serena deliver the absolute greatest performance of her professional life. She was using a script she had stolen entirely from my locked hard drive. She seamlessly navigated through deeply complex structural diagrams that I had literally mapped out on my living room floor with a black marker. She proudly defined the rigid parameters of our rapid response culture using the exact same sentences I had desperately written in an email to a stranded truck driver 3 years ago. She eloquently praised the brilliant architecture of our strategic vendor partnerships, as if she had personally shaken hands with the exhausted warehouse managers who did not even know her first name. She owned the room with absolute, unearned authority. It was a breathtaking masterclass in pure professional plagiarism. But while Serena was busy performing for the glowing projector screen, I was busy watching the actual power in the room. Elias Thorne was not looking at the beautiful, heavily stylized slides. He was watching the people. He quietly observed Grant Holloway nervously tapping his expensive silver pen against the mahogany table. He noticed the slight, uncomfortable shifts in posture from the middle management team sitting tightly in the second row. Elias knew perfectly well that beautiful graphics and confident delivery could easily hide a rotting, unstable foundation. Serena clicked a button on her remote, bringing up a polished summary slide, and offered a bright, highly inviting smile. I would be absolutely happy to open the floor to any initial questions the Briarcrest team might have regarding the framework, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sugary confidence. Elias leaned forward slowly. He rested his heavy elbows firmly on the polished wood and folded his hands together. Let us talk about the actual dirt on the tires. Serena, Elias said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the large room. Your presentation slides look absolutely fantastic, but when a major winter storm wipes out Interstate 90 and your primary freight routes are completely overloaded with rotting cargo, how exactly does this specific system prioritize the massive backlog? I am not asking for your broad corporate philosophy. I am asking for the exact mechanical trigger. And regarding your so-called exclusive relationships with these auxiliary cold storage units across the Midwest, how legally binding are those contracts when a much higher-paying competitor suddenly needs the exact same frozen space? The entire boardroom went dead silent. Serena's bright smile remained entirely frozen on her face, but her eyes flickered with a sudden, sharp, undeniable panic. These were not the soft, high-level strategy questions she had rehearsed for hours with Grant. These were gritty, tactical, street-level interrogations. Furthermore, Elias continued smoothly, not giving her a single second to catch her breath, at what exact hour of a cascading network failure does your beautiful routing algorithm officially tap out? When do you pull the plug on the automated software and force a living, breathing human being to make a manual, life or death logistical decision regarding medical supplies? Serena swallowed hard. Her throat bobbed visibly. She gripped the sharp edges of the wooden podium until her knuckles turned completely white. She opened her mouth and immediately deployed a heavy, suffocating smokescreen of bow corporate st. She started throwing around vague technical language about rerouting capacity, failover procedures, and vendor flexibility. It sounded polished, but it did not answer the problem in front of her. She was using buzzwords to dodge a practical question that required a real operator. Mira Donnelly abruptly stopped typing on her laptop. She closed the lid with a sharp snap. Curtis Bale raised a highly skeptical eyebrow and exchanged a very long, very deliberate look of utter disappointment with Elias. Elias held up a single, flat hand, stopping Serena right in the middle of a breathless sentence about risk mitigation. "Stop," Elias commanded softly. That single word hit the tense room like a physical blow to the stomach. Serena's mouth snapped shut. Elias slowly closed his leather notebook. He looked directly across the table at Mason Weller, completely ignoring Serena for a long, agonizing moment, before finally shifting his cold gaze back to the podium. "We are not going to sit here and debate the hypothetical, academic merits of your slide deck for another 2 hours while $30 million of my capital hangs in the balance," Elias stated firmly, his tone carrying the absolute weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You explicitly claim this North Star framework is the absolute backbone of your operational valuation. You claim it can handle the absolute worst-case scenarios without a single dropped shipment or compromised patient." Serena blinked rapidly, completely thrown off balance by the aggressive shift in tone. "Excuse me, Elias, we have the verified historical data right here in the printed appendix. The numbers speak for themselves. I do not want historical data, Elias replied, his voice cutting through the heavy, refrigerated air like a razor blade. I want a live demonstration. Right now. I want your operational team to boot up the direct simulation you mentioned in your executive summary. I want to see this incredible machine run a high-stress scenario in real time. I want to watch the live dashboards react, and I want to watch you manage it before we discuss another single dollar of our capital investment. The IT director nervously typed a series of commands on his laptop, projecting the live operational dashboard onto the massive screen at the front of the boardroom. The room plunged into a tense silence, broken only by the steady hum of the climate control vents. This was no longer a theoretical exercise. The simulation software loaded the exact parameters of a catastrophic triple-threat scenario. First, a complete refrigeration failure at our primary transit hub. Second, a severe winter whiteout forcing the immediate closure of 2 major federal interstate highways. Finally, an unprecedented, simultaneous spike in critical demand from regional dialysis centers. It was a digital nightmare specifically designed to break weak systems and expose lazy executives. Serena stepped up to the control terminal. Her posture was rigid, but her eyes darted frantically across the cascading alerts. The screen demanded immediate rerouting for 36 temperature-sensitive loads. The software automatically generated 5 potential solutions. Serena scanned the options and immediately, confidently clicked on the absolute cheapest, fastest-looking route displayed on the monitor. It was a regional carrier path through the Northern Logistics Corridor. From the shadows of the back row, I watched the disaster unfold in slow motion. I knew exactly why that specific route was a fatal trap. That northern carrier had a rigid, ironclad exclusivity clause explicitly written into their union contract. During severe weather events, they legally prioritized their own Tier 1 corporate clients before touching any secondary outsourced freight. By blindly selecting that route to save a few dollars on a spreadsheet, Serena had just driven 36 shipments of life-saving medication straight into a bureaucratic brick wall. Those simulated trucks would sit idle in a freezing holding lot for a minimum of 6 hours before anyone even looked at the manifests. Almost instantly, the massive digital dashboard reacted to her catastrophic error. The soft yellow warning indicators suddenly flashed into angry, aggressive clusters of solid red. The simulated timeline for patient delivery extended well past the safety threshold. The room grew incredibly tight. Several middle managers sitting in the second row began exchanging nervous, terrified glances. They recognized the route parameters. They knew she was aggressively steering the entire operation directly off a cliff. Grant Holloway desperately tried to throw his chief operating officer a lifeline. He leaned heavily over the polished mahogany table and pointed a shaky finger at the screen. "It appears we are just experiencing a minor data latency issue with the visual feed," Grant announced to the room, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "The North Star framework is currently dynamically reallocating the loads in the background. The visual dashboard simply has not caught up to the algorithm yet." It was a pathetic, transparent lie. The sophisticated investors knew it. I knew it. The real error was not the software. The fatal flaw was that Serena had completely skipped the mandatory manual override protocol. She trusted the shiny interface instead of picking up a telephone and calling the warehouse floor to negotiate a physical, human bypass. As Serena frantically clicked her mouse, desperately trying to undo her command, the simulation was suddenly and violently interrupted. A harsh, piercing electronic siren sliced through the freezing air of the boardroom. It was not coming from the massive speakers at the front of the room. It was not part of the carefully designed investor test. The sound was raw, urgent, and undeniably real. It was emanating directly from my right blazer pocket. My personal cell phone was aggressively vibrating against my hip, blaring the exact, distinct emergency ringtone reserved exclusively for a critical Tier 1 cold chain failure. The giant screen at the front of the room flickered, and a real-world alert forcefully overlaid the simulation dashboard. It was a live distress signal. A highly sensitive shipment of specialized fluids, destined for a critical care dialysis clinic, had just experienced a catastrophic compressor failure in transit somewhere just outside of Dayton. The internal temperature of the trailer was rising rapidly toward the danger zone. The entire boardroom completely froze. The suffocating silence that followed the piercing alarm was heavier than lead. Every single head in the room slowly turned away from the glowing screen and looked directly toward the dark back corner where I sat. They all understood the terrifying gravity of what was happening. Despite Serena proudly parading her stolen framework, despite the formal termination announcements from earlier that morning, the actual, living nervous system of Norval Logistics was still desperately seeking the only person who actually knew how to keep it alive. Tessa Rowe, sitting near the middle of the long table, broke the silence. She did not whisper. She spoke the undeniable truth loud enough for the entire room to hear. The priority red alerts are still routing directly to Alina. Elias Thorne stopped taking notes. He slowly rotated his large leather chair and turned his entire body to face me, his cold, calculating eyes locked onto mine. He did not blink. He simply stared, watching my reaction, waiting to see exactly what the invisible architect would do when the building actually caught fire. Up at the front of the room, Serena frantically tapped the wooden podium, her voice shrill and desperate. "Please ignore that interruption. Gentlemen, it is just a legacy glitch in the notification system. The central dispatch team is handling the Dayton route right now. If we return our attention to the main simulation parameters, you will see how North Star categorizes the load balance." I did not let her finish the hollow sentence. I did not gloat or bring up the firing. Lives were on the line, and that mattered more than my anger. I pulled my phone from my pocket, silenced the blaring alarm, and looked directly past Elias Thorne toward the IT director manning the live terminal. "Give me the exact shipment code and the current sub-route designation," I ordered. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion, carrying only the hard, cutting edge of pure operational authority. The IT director swallowed hard, glanced nervously at Mason Weller for permission he did not receive, and then rapidly read the tracking numbers off his screen. I did not need to consult a thick binder. I did not need to run an algorithmic calculation. I knew the Dayton logistics corridor intimately. I knew exactly who was driving the auxiliary routes today. I raised my phone to my ear and tapped a single speed dial number. The entire room watched in absolute paralyzed fascination. "Ramona, it is Alina," I said, my words clipping out in a rapid, precise cadence. "I need an immediate intercept. You have a rig deadheading northbound on Interstate 75, currently 15 miles outside of Dayton. Cross-reference code Delta 902. The primary trailer lost its compressor. I need your driver to pull alongside at the rest stop at exit 44 and execute a manual cross-dock transfer immediately. Tell him I am authorizing double the emergency premium rate. Get those pallets into a cold environment within 14 minutes." I hung up the phone. I did not sit back down. I stared intensely at the massive screen at the front of the room. For exactly 120 seconds, the only sound in the boardroom was the collective, shallow breathing of 30 terrified corporate executives. Elias Thorne remained completely still, his eyes darting analytically between my stoic face and the glowing dashboard. Then, the live alert on the main screen blinked. The angry, flashing red warning icon stabilized. It slowly transitioned into a calm, steady yellow. The automated text updated, confirming the critical cargo had been successfully transferred to a stable, temperature-controlled environment. The delivery was officially back on schedule. The crisis was completely neutralized. Right there, in front of the most ruthless private equity investors in the country, the absolute truth materialized in real time. The brilliant, sophisticated North Star continuity framework they were preparing to buy was not a piece of software. It was not a slide deck. It was not Serena Vale. The machine was my memory. The safety net was my personal reputation. The system was the living, breathing network of human trust I had painstakingly built over 4 exhausting years. And as Elias Thorne watched the red light fade away, the absolute reality finally dawned on him. I was the only person in the room holding the keys to the kingdom. Elias Thorne did not applaud. He did not smile. He simply raised his right hand, extending a single index finger toward the information technology director. "Freeze the simulation," Elias commanded. The massive screen at the front of the room locked into place. The fake disaster was paused, but the real crisis had just been utterly dismantled. Elias slowly turned his heavy leather chair back toward the front of the room. He bypassed Mason Weller entirely. He locked his piercing, analytical gaze directly onto Serena Vale. "Who is she?" Elias asked. The question was not a polite request for a name. It was a cold demand for an explanation. Serena gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly, her knuckles looked like polished marble. A thin bead of sweat broke through her expensive cosmetic foundation. "She is Alina Price," Serena stammered, her previously commanding voice now reduced to a thin, reedy whisper. "She is a former logistics coordinator. Her employment was officially terminated this morning due to internal restructuring." The phrase "former coordinator" hung in the freezing air of the boardroom. It sounded incredibly pathetic. It was a flimsy, paper-thin shield against the massive reality the entire room had just witnessed. Elias leaned back, steepling his fingers under his chin. His voice remained perfectly level, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "Let me make sure I fully comprehend this situation," Elias said slowly. "You are telling me that a terminated lower-level coordinator just manually bypassed your entire executive protocol and resolved a Tier 1 thermal failure in under 3 minutes, using nothing but a cell phone and a memorized route map. Meanwhile, your senior leadership team managed to crash a highly controlled, hypothetical software test into a catastrophic bottleneck within exactly 60 seconds. Is that the specific narrative you are presenting to my firm?" Serena opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. The polished corporate vocabulary had completely failed her. I did not wait for her to desperately search for a new lie. I stood up from my chair in the back row. I picked up the heavy binder resting at my feet. The rhythmic click of my low heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the cavernous room as I walked deliberately toward the front. "The North Star continuity framework is a beautifully formatted lie," I stated, my voice projecting clearly to every corner of the long table. "It does not exist. It cannot dynamically reallocate loads, and it certainly does not possess algorithmic elasticity. What you are looking at on that screen is a stolen, deeply misunderstood copy of a manual system I built over the last 4 years. I called it the Bridge Ledger." I reached the massive mahogany table. I dropped the thick binder directly in front of Elias Thorne. The heavy thud echoed sharply off the glass walls. "The Bridge Ledger is not a piece of magical software," I continued, making direct eye contact with the lead investor. "It is a complex ecosystem of living, breathing human relationships. It is the truck drivers, the independent cold storage managers, and the regional dispatchers who trust my voice when the automated systems completely fail. You cannot buy their loyalty with a slick presentation slide, and you certainly cannot manage them if you do not even know their actual names." I opened the binder. I did not deal in emotional accusations. I dealt exclusively in hard, undeniable data. "Exhibit A," I said, sliding a perfectly printed document across the polished wood. "The digital version history of the primary logic board Serena presented to you 20 minutes ago. You will see that the native files were created in my personal user directory exactly 3 years and 2 months ago. You will also see the timestamp from exactly 48 hours ago, when Grant Holloway dragged those native files into a sanitized executive folder." Mira Donnelly, the lead financial analyst for Briarcrest, did not wait for permission. Her fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, directly accessing the secure investor data room they had been granted access to earlier that morning. "Mr. Thorne," Mira interrupted, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. "I am looking at the raw metadata properties for the core framework documents right now. Every single foundational file in this repository lists the original author as A. Price. The executive summaries were modified yesterday, but the underlying architectural mathematics are exclusively hers. Grant Holloway visibly slumped in his chair, his face buried deeply in his hands. He knew the digital trail was absolutely fatal. I slid the next set of papers across the table. Exhibit B, I announced calmly. Signed confirmation letters from independent suppliers. Here is a text message from Ramona Pike, the fleet owner who just saved your Dayton shipment. The message is from Serena Vale's office, explicitly ordering Ramona to remove my name from her vendor testimonial so the executive board could claim the overarching credit. Next to it is a backdated overflow contract from Deke Halverson, proving they actively falsified their operational timeline to match my previous successes. Curtis Bale, the representative from the massive operational insurance conglomerate, leaned heavily into the table. His face was a mask of pure professional fury. "This is not just an internal human resources dispute," Curtis barked, glaring at Mason Weller. "The massive premium discount my firm underwrote for Norval Response Logistics last fiscal year was explicitly contingent on the operational risk profile submitted under the direct supervision of Alina Price. We ensured her specific methodology. If she is no longer the architect, and if your executives are driving this machine without understanding the brakes, our entire liability model is completely void. We will pull your coverage by the end of the business day." Mason Weller finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. This was no longer about who got a bonus or a promotion. The $30 million acquisition was actively dying right in front of him, and the insurance revocation would bankrupt the company within 4 weeks. "Alina, please," Mason pleaded, holding up his hands in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Let us take a step back. We can step into my office and discuss an immediate reinstatement. We can negotiate a highly aggressive compensation package." I looked at the chief executive officer with absolute cold disgust. "We are far past negotiations, Mason," I said coldly, "because you did not just steal my work. You tried to frame me for your inevitable failure." I pulled the final, most devastating document from the back of the binder. I placed it directly in front of Elias and Naomi Voss, the Briarcrest Legal Counsel. "This is a printed copy of the final compliance appendix currently sitting in your secured investor data room," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, hard register. "It legally guarantees the operational readiness of the system under penalty of federal wire fraud. If you look at line item 42, you will see my printed name and my authorized cryptographic electronic signature." Naomi Voss leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the document. "I was officially terminated this morning," I continued, ensuring every single word landed like a physical blow. Yet my top-level system credentials remained fully active. I never reviewed this final appendix. I never gave my consent. I never applied that electronic signature. Your chief operating officer forged my digital authorization to provide a legal shield for a multi-million-dollar financial transaction. The boardroom went completely, terrifyingly silent. The heavy gravity of corporate fraud had just landed squarely on the mahogany table. Elias Thorne did not yell. He simply picked up the speakerphone sitting in the center of the table and hit the dial button for the conference bridge. He wanted third-party verification. He dialed Janelle Mercer, the senior operations manager for the largest regional clinic chain in their portfolio. The phone rang twice before Janelle answered. Her voice echoed loudly through the room. "This is Janelle Mercer," the voice confirmed. "Ms. Mercer, this is Elias Thorne with Briarcrest Capital," Elias said smoothly. "I am sitting here with the Norval executive team. Can you confirm the status of your account management regarding Alina Price?" There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "I already made this abundantly clear to Grant Holloway," Janelle said, her tone sharp with irritation. "We exclusively renewed our 2-year contract because of Alina, but frankly, Mr. Thorne, I am deeply concerned about the ethics of this management team. Serena Vale's office called my directors yesterday afternoon. They explicitly told us that Alina was suffering from a severe mental breakdown, that she was highly unstable, and that she was being permanently removed from our account for our own safety. Janelle's words echoed off the glass walls. The professional betrayal had mutated from simple theft into a calculated, malicious character assassination. They had actively tried to destroy my professional reputation to ensure I could never work in this industry again. Elias pressed the mute button on the console. He looked at Serena. She was trembling, completely broken, stripped of every single lie she had meticulously built. The documents had spoken, and the truth was absolutely deafening. Mason Weller desperately tried to put the shattered pieces of his company back together. His face was flushed with a deep, unhealthy crimson. He stood up from his leather chair, forcefully buttoning his expensive suit jacket in a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of executive authority. "Gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this highly unorthodox disruption," Mason announced, raising his voice to speak over the heavy tension in the room. "This is clearly a complicated internal human resources matter that has unfortunately spilled over into our executive summit. Let us take a brief 30-minute recess. We will clear the room, resolve this internal miscommunication, and recalibrate our presentation." Elias Thorne did not move a single muscle. He remained seated, his hands folded neatly on the mahogany table. "Sit down. Mason," Elias commanded. The tone was not a request. It was an absolute directive from a man who held the financial lifeblood of the company in his hands. "We are not taking a recess. And we are certainly not sweeping severe corporate fraud under the convenient rug of an internal human resources dispute." Mason froze, his mouth slightly open, before slowly sinking back into his chair. Naomi Voss, the sharp legal counsel representing Briarcrest Capital, leaned forward. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and looked directly at Serena Vale with the cold, detached gaze of an executioner. "Let me be incredibly precise about the legal landscape you are currently standing on," Naomi said, her voice dropping the temperature of the room another 10 degrees. "Appropriating authorship from a subordinate is a severe ethical failing, but actively deploying an unapproved cryptographic electronic signature on a binding compliance appendix is entirely different. Deliberately misrepresenting your operational capacity to secure $30 million from an investment fund, while simultaneously lying to your operational insurance provider, is textbook financial fraud. You have fundamentally altered the entire investment thesis under false pretenses. The sheer weight of the impending legal consequences finally broke the weakest link in the executive chain. Grant Holloway could no longer handle the terrifying, unblinking stares of the Briarcrest due diligence team. The vice president of strategy physically backed his chair away from Serena, shaking his head frantically. "I told her it was far too risky," Grant blurted out, his voice shrill and entirely devoid of loyalty. "I explicitly told Serena we could not just erase the original author files. But she looked right at me and said that once the capital is secured in our accounts, absolutely no one is going to care who wrote the initial draft documents." Serena snapped her head toward Grant, her eyes wide with feral, desperate betrayal. She opened her mouth to scream at him, but before she could formulate a single defense, the final nail was driven firmly into her coffin. Tessa Rowe stood up from her seat in the middle of the long table. Tessa, who had spent years quietly surviving under Serena's tyrannical management, did not whisper this time. She walked directly up to Elias Thorne and handed him a printed transcript of an internal digital chat. "They never actually expected the live simulation to succeed," Tessa stated clearly, her voice echoing perfectly off the glass walls. "That is a direct internal communication from 8 o'clock this morning. Serena and Grant explicitly agreed that if the system crashed during your test, they would officially blame the massive operational bottleneck on Alina's deeply flawed legacy mistakes. They staged her public firing this morning so they would have a highly convenient scapegoat when their stolen framework inevitably failed." Elias read the printed transcript in absolute silence. His expression remained completely unreadable. Then, he tossed the paper onto the center of the table. He delivered a brutal truth that completely shattered Mason Weller's entire overarching business philosophy. "The most pathetic part of this entire charade," Elias began, his gravelly voice carrying absolute authority, is that you fundamentally misunderstood our interest. You assumed my firm wanted to buy your entire logistics company. We do not care about your bloated executive salaries. We do not care about your failing standard freight division. Briarcrest only ever saw true financial value in the isolated, continuous operations block. We came here specifically for the resilient architecture that this woman built. Elias turned his chair entirely away from the executive team. He looked directly at me. The room held its collective breath. The power dynamic had violently shifted, and every single person in the room knew it. "Ms. Price," Elias said, addressing me with a level of profound professional respect he had denied the chief executive officer. "What is your actual operating profit margin on the bridge ledger network? I do not want the blended corporate nonsense Mason was peddling earlier. I want the margins for your specific division." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not let a single ounce of emotional revenge bleed into my voice. I answered him with the cold, hard mathematics of pure operational survival. 22.4%, I replied instantly. The executive suite intentionally blends my high-yield margins with their standard freight losses to make the overall quarterly reports look acceptable to the board. My specific cost to maintain the secondary backup network is roughly $150,000 per quarter, primarily tied up in retainer fees for independent cold storage yards. However, that specific expenditure reduces our Tier 1 medical client churn rate to exactly 0%. Every single hospital network I personally manage has aggressively renewed their long-term contract for the last 3 consecutive years. Mira Donnelly began typing frantically on her laptop, her eyes darting between my face and her complex financial models. Elias nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the razor-sharp precision of the data. "And what about scaling?" Elias pressed further, testing the absolute limits of my strategic vision. "If I inject $10 million specifically into your continuity architecture tomorrow morning, can you realistically replicate this localized Ohio model across the entire Midwest region?" "Yes," I answered firmly, holding his gaze without a single moment of hesitation. "But you do not scale this model by purchasing more expensive software licenses or hiring bloated strategy vice presidents. You scale it by aggressively acquiring distressed, independent cold storage facilities in secondary markets like Indianapolis, Detroit, and Milwaukee. You integrate those hard assets into the proprietary dispatch ledger. You intentionally bypass the major unionized freight routes during severe weather events, and you offer guaranteed, penalty-backed delivery windows directly to the major pharmaceutical manufacturers. The actual market pain point is not a lack of refrigerated trucks. It is a severe lack of flexible, localized routing authority during state-level emergencies. The sheer, undeniable weight of actual street-level competence silenced the executive end of the table completely. Suddenly, from the second row of chairs, the director of regional sales cleared his throat. He had been silent the entire morning, but the shifting tide of absolute power gave him courage. "She is absolutely right," the sales director said, his voice shaking slightly at first, but rapidly gaining strength. "I have personally held on to 3 major pharmaceutical accounts this fiscal year, solely because I promised their administrators that Alina would be their direct escalation contact. They do not care about our branded corporate synergy. They only care that Alina actually answers her phone." Another manager, a senior woman who handled the brutal northern transit routes, nodded firmly and spoke up. "When the regional power grid went down in January, Serena told my department to draft generic legal apology letters to our clients," the manager stated clearly. "Alina bypassed the chain of command. She told us to rent commercial cargo vans and pack them manually with dry ice from local suppliers. Alina kept the accounts alive while the executive team was busy consulting their lawyers. The strategic reversal was completely absolute. It was a flawless, devastating checkmate. Serena Vale had meticulously orchestrated a brutal, highly public firing that morning to completely diminish my existence. She wanted to strip away my power and erase my legacy. But by violently forcing me out of the shadows and attempting to wear my professional skin in front of the sharpest predators in the financial industry, she had achieved the exact opposite result. She had inadvertently provided a live, undeniable, multi-million-dollar demonstration that she fundamentally did not understand the very machine she was desperately trying to hijack. The public execution meant to make me incredibly small had ultimately become the undeniable proof of my absolute value. The massive, freezing boardroom was no longer Mason Weller's domain. It belonged entirely to the raw numbers, the hard truth, and the invisible woman who had just methodically dismantled a massive corporate theft without ever raising her voice. The atmosphere in the massive boardroom had shifted from a highly controlled corporate theater to a completely exposed crime scene. The heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the long mahogany table was absolute. Every single layer of executive deception had been violently stripped away, leaving nothing but the raw, undeniable truth exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mason Weller sat entirely frozen, his face a portrait of complete administrative defeat. Grant Holloway was staring blankly at the polished wood, desperately wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. Elias Thorne did not look at Serena Vale. He did not spare a single passing glance at the chief executive officer. He slowly reached into his expensive leather briefcase, pulled out a crisp, heavy linen folder, and placed it deliberately in the exact center of the table. He turned his entire body away from the executive leadership and locked his sharp, predatory eyes entirely on me. "They said you were fired, Ms. Price. Are you willing to run the only division here I'm prepared to invest in?" Elias asked, his voice cutting cleanly through the absolute stillness of the room. He pushed the heavy folder across the table until it rested directly in front of me. "That is a preliminary draft term sheet," Elias stated with absolute authority. "Briarcrest Capital will not inject a single dollar into the bloated, sinking ship that Mason Weller is currently steering. We are only authorizing the immediate release of funds under one highly specific, non-negotiable structural condition. The entire continuous operations division, including your bridge ledger network and all affiliated emergency routing contracts, will be aggressively carved out of Norval. It will be officially spun off into a brand new, fully independent corporate subsidiary. We will name it Bridge North Continuity." I looked down at the pristine legal document. My name was already printed boldly at the top of the executive structure chart. "You will not be a logistics coordinator," Elias continued, his tone echoing with the weight of absolute power. "You will be installed as the president of Bridge North. You will receive a substantial, legally binding equity stake in the new subsidiary. You will possess unilateral authority to select your own operational team, and you will retain absolute control over the system architecture you built. You will no longer answer to Serena Vale. You will no longer report to Mason Weller. You will report directly to the Briarcrest Executive Board in New York." Elias leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows on the table, directing his next words like precise sniper fire toward the pale executive sitting across from him. "The capital injection is also strictly contingent upon a series of immediate, highly punitive corporate actions," Elias commanded. "First, Briarcrest will deploy an independent forensic accounting firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of every single operational record generated over the last 4 years. Second, Serena Vale and Grant Holloway are to be permanently and immediately stripped of all operational control and system access. Third, every single independent sub-supplier on your network must be paid their overdue invoices in full by the end of the business day tomorrow. Finally, your legal department will draft a formal, written cessation of any and all defamatory statements regarding Alina Price's professional competency." The room was entirely paralyzed. The sheer magnitude of the hostile takeover was breathtaking. They had invited a shark into their fragile glass tank, and the shark had immediately decided to buy the only valuable fish and shatter the glass. I looked at the term sheet. It was the ultimate vindication. It was everything I had bled for over the last 4 years, suddenly handed to me on a silver platter. But I did not immediately reach for the expensive pen resting next to the folder. True power is not just aggressively taking what you are offered. True power is calmly dictating the final terms of the surrender. I looked directly back at Elias Thorne. my expression perfectly neutral. Your capital structure is highly efficient, Mr. Thorne, I replied evenly. But my operational network relies heavily on the people at the bottom, not just the executives at the top. If I am going to run Bridge North continuity, I require 3 additional, non-negotiable clauses to be permanently appended to this term sheet right now. Elias raised a single intrigued eyebrow. State your terms. First, I began, my voice clear and unwavering. Any corporate restructuring inevitably leads to warehouse-level casualties. I want a legally binding, fully funded severance protection package established for every single blue-collar warehouse worker and dock loader who might be displaced during the corporate spin-off. They will not pay the price for executive mismanagement. I paused, letting the financial weight of the demand settle over the room before turning my gaze toward the terrified chief executive officer. Second, I continued coldly, Mason will personally sign a formal letter of correction. This letter will clearly detail the exact nature of the operational transition and explicitly retract the malicious, fabricated statements regarding my mental stability. It will be sent via certified mail to every single Tier 1 client on our roster before 5 o'clock this evening. Finally, I turned my attention to the middle of the long table, looking directly at the woman who had bravely risked her own career to smuggle me the internal chat logs. Third, I stated firmly, Tessa Rowe is immediately resigning from her current role under Serena. She is transferring to Bridge North Continuity as my newly appointed Vice President of Client Relations, with a base compensation package directly reflecting her actual market value, completely separate from Norval's existing pay scale. Tessa gasped softly, pressing her hand over her mouth as tears of absolute shock and profound relief instantly welled in her eyes. Elias Thorne did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Naomi, Elias said, glancing at his lead legal counsel, add those specific stipulations to the final addendum. Have the revised paperwork ready for signature within the hour. Mason Weller sat completely trapped in his expensive leather chair. He had absolutely no remaining leverage. His only other viable alternative was facing a total financial collapse within a matter of weeks, suffering the complete loss of all remaining market trust, and likely defending himself against severe legal consequences for the forged compliance documents. He swallowed his massive pride, stared down at the polished table, and gave a slow, utterly defeated nod of agreement. I finally allowed myself to look at Serena Vale. There was no loud, dramatic, cinematic breakdown. She did not scream or throw her coffee cup across the room. Her punishment was infinitely more profound and substantially more agonizing. Her absolute worst nightmare had just materialized in real time. She was forced to sit silently in her perfectly tailored suit and watch the exact same people who had witnessed her humiliate me just hours earlier now watch me systematically extract the single most valuable asset from her failing company. She was completely paralyzed, suffocating under the crushing weight of her own weaponized arrogance, utterly destroyed by the undeniable truth of a signed document. The meeting was officially adjourned. The executives pushed their chairs back and filed out in stunned silence. I did not leave Norval Response Logistics that afternoon, carrying 2 cheap brown cardboard boxes filled with desk trinkets, like the broken woman they had attempted to discard that morning. I stood up tall, smoothing the front of my dark blue suit. I gathered my original, heavy data binders. I picked up the preliminary draft term sheet representing millions of dollars in real structural power. As I walked down the main corporate corridor toward the front lobby, the entire office had gone silent. The eyes of every single person in the building, the middle managers who had looked away, the executives who had lied, and the operations staff who had silently prayed for a miracle, finally looked straight at me. I walked through the automatic glass doors and stepped out into the crisp Ohio air. That is the heart of a real revenge story. You do not achieve actual justice by becoming louder, crueler, or more manipulative than the people who tried to bury you. You secure your revenge by methodically forcing the power and the leverage to flow back into the hands of the person who actually created the value. You simply allow the thieves who tried to steal your spotlight to live forever in the excruciating, quiet moment when the absolute truth strips away their entire stage. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people out there.